Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hi, Jessica. Welcome to the Quest podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for taking the time today. I've been saying this a lot these last few episodes. I'm working toward 100 episodes of the Quest podcast. So I'm down to like the last 5. You're in my final 5 guests before that marquee 100th episode. So it's always fun. Anytime I have doctors on the show, the audience loves it. It's a good change of pace. We get into some great conversations. And I'm very interested in chatting to you today about some things that you've written. I think my fan base knows I'm a big fan of psychologytoday.com, and I think I've read every article on it. And I came across some of yours, and I really liked how you write. And I thought I'm going to reach out to her and see if she'll come on, and we can get into discussion about some things, because my normal resident psychologist, Dr. Katie Mooney, co-hosts a podcast I produce about cults. So people have already gotten enough of Dr. Katie, so I need to bring on some new blood in the psychology world. So I'm really happy you could come out today. I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
To get started, why don't you just tell the listeners a little about yourself, a little about your background, your education, and things like that before we get started.
Sure. I'll go back quite a few decades. I'm Dr. Jessica Koehler. My background is in psychology. Specifically, my Ph.D. is in school educational psychology. I've pivoted quite a bit since I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland, where I was really interested in understanding teacher beliefs and how they have an influence on student learning. Still very, very interesting, but I've kind of expanded my horizons a lot. I've worked in neuroscience labs, studying dyslexia, autism. I've worked as a practicing psychologist in public schools and university settings. Worked on several large research projects at universities looking at sort of character education, bullying programs, just really big interventions within school districts and the effects they have on students and staff members. And then I pivoted a bunch after having children and ended up going into, teaching undergraduate and then now graduate and undergraduate level classes in psychology and writing for Psychology Today, which I absolutely love, which is how you connected with me, where I have a blog, which is really focused on connecting the science of psychology to everyday life. So having a big background in sort of the academic world earlier on. And I realized that I wanted to figure out a way to convey information from the field of psychology and help it be meaningful to everyone, because I feel like problematically that doesn't happen very often. And so that's really what I'm focused on within my writing. And I like to call myself sort of a psychological generalist or sort of a psychological polymath. Lots of times psychologists, which is amazing, they have expertise in one area which they become wholly focused on.
Sure.
We need that for sure. We need those specialists, but I have kind of taken on a role based on my probably a little bit of my attention problems, right? I move my focus around a lot. I am interested in multiple domains of psychology across the board. I taught sort of introductory psychology, which kind of covers every single domain in psychology for a long time. So I have an interest across a wide array of topics within psychology, from cognitive biases and education, perception, neuroscience, even more clinical applied types of things, which is where I started my career earlier. So I just try to bring it all together in my writing and write in ways that sort of can have an effect and be meaningful to people in their everyday life, whether it's like learning, how the cognitive science principles and how we can learn better, or how different social psychological principles are interfering in our relationships, or in our parenting. I talk a lot about parenting and relationships,
For sure.
That kind of thing. So that's kind of where I am, and I teach fully remotely now through the University of Arizona Global Campus. So that's I'm also a professor in that domain. So yeah.
Gotcha. What was your initial interest in psychology? What made you pursue this?
Well, a little bit about I've had some interesting family background experiences that sort of pushed me into really wanting to understand human behavior.
Mhm.
And I'd say that happened really early on. And even from the time I was probably 12 years old, I was a little bit of the family psychologist.
Mhm.
So I took on a parentified role a little bit early on. But I must also say a big influence was my grandmother. Was actually the first school psychologist in Western Pennsylvania. And she started like the gifted program and everything in a town in Western Pennsylvania, and got her master's degree, very early on. And she was born in 1919. So she was a bit of a maverick as a female in the field of psychology. So I definitely had some influence from her, but also a big pull just to understand human behavior, and a lot about how we learn too.
I thought you might mention family.
Yeah.
And in fact, the follow-up question to that was, where did you grow up? And did you grow up spiritual and religious? I wanted to hear a little bit maybe about your early life, if you wouldn't mind sharing. Because just in the first 2 minutes since we've been talking, since even before we started recording this episode, I had to ask where you're at. You're in Utah, but you went to school in, Maryland, and you work at Arizona University, and then you talk about, and I'm like, you're all over the place. All over the coast.
Yeah.
So,
That's true. Yes. So I have lived in a lot of places, and that started young, actually. Well, I was born in Western Pennsylvania. I'm from a long line of Pittsburgh Steelers fans.
oh, all right.
I'm not so much into professional football, but I better say that I'm a Steelers fan, and my dad might be really upset. I am a fan of sports. I was very, very, very into soccer. Back a long time ago, I was actually, my family moved from Western Pennsylvania to Central Pennsylvania, and I was super into soccer and actually went to college originally to play soccer. So, and that was where I met my husband, who also played soccer. But I have lived in Pennsylvania, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Georgia, Colorado, California, northern and southern California, Utah, Arizona. Have I missed anywhere? So we've lived a lot of places. And I think that, interestingly, contributes significantly to sort of my perspective of the world. Just having had those experiences has been fascinating. You asked in terms of my religious upbringing. I was raised, I went to CCD. I was Catholic when I was younger. I ended up making the choice not to be confirmed myself at 13 years old, which was really interesting. And I consider myself more of, on the, I'm not a part of an organized religion, more of a belief in a spiritual being, and, having core values that guide my behavior that are probably very, very informed by my Christian upbringing, right? But I pivoted a bit from being fully in line with my earlier Catholic upbringing.
It's always an interesting question when I ask any kind of doctor about religion and spirituality, because it's kind of like when you start to get into those advanced degrees and you move into these dedicated styles of work, a lot of people lose their religion, they lose their spirituality, they lose all of that. So I'm always curious to ask people where they stand on it, in their life. But we'll move on, because, you answered it great. I also grew up Catholic, not a confirmed Catholic, but I'll always call myself one because I was baptized a Catholic. And
Me too.
that's sort of, you know how it is. We're always kind of indoctrinated into stuff before we have a choice for the indoctrination.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting that you say that, because I would say that earlier on in my education, I probably had lost my religion to some extent. And I feel like later, I'm 47, and I feel like later in life, it's come back to me, probably having children and, and having different experiences and understanding again, like the core values that guide my behavior and how those align very much with principles of Christianity and what I learned in Catholicism. So like there's complete alignment, and so it kind of makes more sense to me at this age for sure.
I think once the science starts to come in, it starts to kill the idea of, this other bigger picture. I think maybe that's the beginning of it. I mentioned, you kind of indoctrinated into things like religion, and I think it's fascinating. You mentioned, growing up Catholic, which was obviously your parents baptizing you and moving you into that before you even knew what was happening. And then also you mentioned you were a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, obviously something that was indoctrinated into you. You probably grew up, you had a father that was a Pittsburgh Steelers fan. You became a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, right? Is that how it works? I think that's how early indoctrination works. I think you see your dad vote Democrat, and then you're kind of a Democrat because you want to be on a side. And I think a lot of people mirror what their parents do, especially in those young ages, until you're out in the world and can.
Right. No, that tribalism starts young, right? We start getting, and we can think about it, you did an amazing job just mentioning several categories, whether it was religion, sports teams, or political affiliation, that we get usually, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes we align most closely with our parents or whoever is raising us at that point in time as children. And then as we go through, teenagerhood and become adults, oftentimes we do stay aligned with those beliefs, but other times we end up, getting some of those beliefs challenged and altering those thoughts as well. And that's an area that I'm super interested in terms of the study of psychology. Yeah. And
if the listeners that are familiar with my books, I write about this in my first book about kind of those early indoctrinations of things. And it's more than that too. I think as kids, you don't understand. You're kind of indoctrinated into an educational system. You're in public school, you're in Catholic school, whatever you might be in, so you're sort of subjected to that level of education. And that could vary in parts of the city that you're in and the kids that you're around and things like that. And also economically, growing up, I grew up very middle class, like as middle as you can get. But some people aren't like that. And you sort of kind of grow up in that too. Sometimes you grow up poor and you don't even know you're poor,
Right. Now, what you're saying is really, really connected to what I've actually written about a lot. And I forgot to mention this at the beginning of the podcast, but I'm actually, another aspect of what I do is we homeschool.
I know.
Which is very divergent from how I grew up, right? Going to public schools and how my husband grew up. And we never thought we would end up homeschooling our children. And my mom is a public school teacher. My sister's a public school teacher. My grandmother was a school psychologist in the public school system. So it was like a very divergent path. And what you're saying, even about socioeconomic status, right? Like having like not understanding that other people grow up in a very different way with very different experiences, and having this ability to, I kind of have written about a lot and think about a lot, the conforming forces that kind of push us to stay in the places that we've always been, right? That push us to stay in the same tribes all the time. Well, whether it's, our political affiliations or our religious affiliations, or even our educational affiliations. Education is an interesting one, but you don't really necessarily think about it. But people feel really strongly if they experienced education in a certain way, like I went to public school or private school, or less people back then were homeschooled, then they feel like that's what they experience and that's what they want their kids to have as well. And it's really hard to look sort of beyond their own experiences to think, is there a different way that could be a better fit for our family or for our children? And I like to constantly think about those things. Like even though I had these experiences in the world, is there a better fit for our family? And that's, how we ended up homeschooling. So.
And I have questions about the homeschooling. I want to bring it up a little later in the episode, but I do have questions about it. Because so many homeschool kids I've met have been exceptional, like just really like mind-bogglingly successful in their lives, and they think on a different level. And it really makes me question maybe the kind of the lowest common denominator of public school that we're getting. Everything's just kind of force-fed mush to us at this point,
right?
From our nutrition to our education, to our entertainment, everything.
To talk about, but I'll tell you, I'll do a little bomb brag. So our 17-year-old son just graduated from college at the age of 17 in May. So he just started graduate school. He's doing a program in international relations.
Wow.
Master's degree starting at 17. So yeah,
Incredible.
It's amazing. And our younger son has some exceptionalities, but it's amazing when you can sort of individually tailor and meet the needs of kids where they are, and based on their interest. It's not just where they are, based on their interests as well, and combine those two, what you're able to accomplish at home. So
yeah, as I mentioned kind of at the start of the podcast, I'm a big fan of the psychologytoday.com website. I'm constantly addicted to reading articles on it, and of course I've come across a couple of yours, and I wanted to maybe just touch on a couple of them. There's so many we could talk about. We could do 9 episodes of just talking about your articles, but there were a couple I wanted to kind of zone in on. So you wrote one called "Why Most Crave Connection and Why Some of Us Don't," and I wanted to kind of just chat about this a little bit. And if it's still fresh in your mind, if you want to tell people like just some of the nutshell of it, and then I want to kind of pick out some particular parts I want to talk about.
Yeah. So what's interesting about social connection is if you look about, I like to look at a lot of things, a lot of these issues through sort of an evolutionary lens, right? Like, what is it that probably helped us to be, survive, right? I mean, and early on, we probably, human beings probably realized that to have more affiliations with group members was safer. Right? It was safer to be in these groups, to not sort of venture out of the group and get attacked by a saber-toothed tiger or some other animal.
Evolutionary response, right?
So probably over time, nature selected for personality traits that emphasized, more of a need for an affiliation. What happens when we have we do have this need for affiliation, but one of the negative aspects of it. And let me back up a little bit. Affiliation generally is a good thing, right? And like feeling connected to other people, having those emotional responses when you're, in a situation and sharing experiences with others can be very positive, to ward off different, mental health issues. One of the things that can happen though is sort of what we call an in-group, out-group bias, going back to what we're just talking about, right? Like that you can think about politics right now because it's everywhere, especially if you're on Twitter, X, that you see that just, if someone's in your tribe, in your group, you sort of assign certain characteristics to them, and people in the other group have negative characteristics, and it can cause lots of friction, right? But there was probably sort of an underlying evolutionary reason for those things early on to keep us safe, right? To keep us in our tribe, to keep us protected from harm. Just like in, like how changes have happened that our bodies haven't kept up with in relation to like nutrition, I don't think that our minds have kept up with how to deal with this sort of in-group, out-group bias. We're not really in the same position where we're worried about saber-toothed tigers coming into our tribe at night, right? But we still have those biases deep-seated within us, these mental shortcuts that we're always taking to like think about the out-group, the heuristics, like to quickly say, oh, they're a Democrat, so they're this, or they're Republicans, so they're this, or they're a Baltimore Ravens fan, so they're automatically like this, right? So we have all these things that come into our mind, but I think in this day and age, they may not be as adaptive, but we haven't quite caught up with that yet, right? Just in the same way that nutritionally, our body, we have not kept, obviously with the obesity rate, especially in the United States, we have not kept up. Our bodies have not evolved to deal with the abundance of food and the changes in whatever quote unquote we call food now. And that's contributed to those issues. What's really interesting is, I think in terms of the affiliation question is, there are people that seem to need less affiliation, that feel less sort of tied to their tribes and have more of an ability to sort of look beyond their own tribe and not feel so compelled to have such negative opinions about the out group and stuff. And so I'm really interested in understanding more of that and looking more deeply into that research, why there are certain people that seem to be able to not immediately, need to have that tight affiliation, need to say, I'm a part of this group, and feel more comfortable sort of going back and forth across different groups and seeing like, oh yeah, there's some aspects of, we'll just go to politics because it's on my mind at the moment. Some aspects of like the Republican Party platform I might be, in alignment with, and some aspects of the Democratic Party, rather than just putting on the team jacket and saying, well, I'm on this team and I'm going to shut down everything else on the other team. But I'm trying to remember what more I wrote about in that article.
Well, I think also, like finding your tribe in a way also is divided on other things like spiritualities, religions, races, like any number. It doesn't even have to be political.
Right.
Like I think for someone who's Black, they are uncomfortable living in a neighborhood where all the people on the street are white. Right. And vice versa. Like, I think, you want to live among your people. And, why would an ultra rich person want to live in a poor subdivision? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you find your tribe in a way. And I think you kind of, again, you're indoctrinated by that as you grow up, the people that you're comfortable with. And I want to and I don't have your article in front of me. So if I make a misstep on describing it, let me know. But so I'm just going to kind of paraphrase a couple of things in it. And I want to, move toward a different conversation about this. Part of your article really talked about the reliance on family and friends and colleagues for that sense of security. You mentioned that, that kind of that evolutionary thing of needing some protection around you. You got to have your people, right? And then you go on to discuss like maybe the dark side of affiliation, such as favoring people within these groups and creating in-groups and out-groups. I think we know in our families, there's certain relatives we like a little more than others, like there's going to be, right? So, and then you talk about the outliers, those who need less affiliation. So this is generally correct from your article, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's definitely kind of what I was getting at, and I think it's really interesting to understand that group of people that need less affiliation.
Yeah. So this is where I want to go with this, though, because this is what I find really fascinating with this, and I talk about this a lot in some of my episodes. So what I really want to know is, are all of these categories just kind of narcissists in disguise? That's really what I want to that's such a buzzword now. I think that the TikTok generation, they think everything's a trauma. Everyone's a narcissist, everything's triggering. Like, that's just sort of how they encompass everything now, that these buzzwords have become, this is what everyone is now, and if you really look at, and I think the list of traits of a narcissist grows every day. From everyone, from the people in the public to the healthcare field, are defining narcissists differently. And everyone can find a trait that's like, that's me, like everyone has a narcissistic trait, right?
Right. Well, I just think in general, I'm sorry to interrupt. So I was just thinking in general, just diagnoses in this, I'm not really on TikTok very much, but I see TikTok posted on other things. Mm-hmm. But, there's just a really strong need right now for like Gen Z, I guess, right?
Gen Zs and alphas, that's where we're at now.
Diagnose themselves with all kinds of things, right? Like, it's like they need to explain things by having some sort of, and it goes to what we're talking about. I feel like it's almost a need to create an identity, right? Like it goes to, like, I'm on the team that has, a diagnosis of ADHD, or I'm in the group that, I have autism, or I have, I have depression, and it's like a label so they can feel an affiliation. Mm-hmm. We'll circle back to this article with this particular group, and I find it fascinating.
Based on kind of those three kind of broad categories that I kind of defined your article as, I wanted to maybe address those a little bit and maybe how it relates to narcissism. I wanted to just kind of like mention the the reliance on family and friends or whatever, So I'm a regular guest on Dr. Drew Pinsky's podcast. So if you know who Dr. Drew is, Dr. Drew's been a friend of mine from like way back to Loveline on MTV. We met back then. Yeah, on MTV. I worked on the MTV show with him. Oh, so that's how old I am.
I'm there too.
But, he wrote a great book about Hollywood narcissism. And he says something that really strikes me as this is where it comes from. He believes that narcissism starts at birth. And he said, you are kind of indoctrinated into this 18-year period of time where you're given everything. And it breeds the narcissist from even when you're a little baby. You cry, you get fed. You cry, you get changed. And let's move up. All your clothes are bought for you. You're fed every day. You're not in charge of any finances. You're driven to school. You're dropped off. This goes on and on and on until you're given a car in high school and your insurance is paid for you. And this may even go all the way up to college. Everything given to you. And then you're pushed out into the world. Okay, go fend for yourself. But all they were programmed with was the need to be given stuff. And he thinks this is why so many people get in these troubled relationships, trying to find someone who will fulfill those needs, and they don't know why. So my first question is does this hold water, this theory, and maybe why people gravitate toward these initial groups for security? Is that maybe partly narcissism? And do you buy into Dr. Drew's theory on this?
I think I've never heard it completely explained. I must have missed that episode. I've never heard it completely explained in that way. But I mean, I tend to believe most psychological manifestations are some sort of combination of genetics and underlying genetic influence in combination with environmental exposure. And of course, parenting in many ways, that environmental exposure, depending on how it's handled, could definitely contribute to that, those narcissistic feelings, right? Even to some of what you were saying was just being a good parent, right? Especially to helpless infants and toddlers and stuff like that. Those sorts of behaviors that we utilize as parents, make the child feel like the center of the world. And how do you sort of pull away from that at appropriate points in time, and and have children feel accountability, more and more as they get older and older. And I think that's problematic, and I think that is something that ends up happening that many parents aren't able to do, right? And I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, but it's really hard. We have a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old, right? So we're right in the heart of figuring out how to we're both of us, my husband and I are very, take accountability for your actions kind of people.
Sure.
But that's hard. That's a hard thing to do. But I do think in terms of what you're saying is that sort of need for affiliation to be in a particular group and to almost feel like adulation and adoration by people that have the same beliefs as yours. Sure, I could definitely see how that is related to narcissism, and that starts my wheels spinning a little bit about, when we're talking about the people that don't have as much of a need for that affiliation across many domains of life. Is it because they don't have as many of them? Is there some relationship that, those are people that really are low sort of on the narcissism scale, that they don't have that need to have agreement and you're right. And your opinions are completely aligned with mine. That's definitely a fascinating perspective. But I am wary of how much the term narcissism is being, as you were saying, thrown about, and some of the other terms like triggering and stuff like that.
In the next part of this, when a person starts to define that in-group and out-group, it's for a benefit to themselves. And I think that, again, also, maybe feeds into this narcissistic thing a little bit. Because a lot of narcissists will define their in-group as like their out-group, like it's the same thing to them. Because, I've got my in-group now, but it's all to my benefit. But you don't ever get that trait unless you're able to define the in-group and the out-group. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it definitely does make sense. I think what's really interesting about the whole in-group, out-group, and what people latch onto as being part of an in-group. We were talking about religion, politics, sports teams, education, whatever it is, how much, and some people it can be a whole bunch of those combined together, and some people it can be, one or a few, how much they take on, that as their actual identity, right? And I think when they take on, I'm going back to the politics one, if they take on, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, as their actual identity, as opposed to these are beliefs I have that could be malleable, which actually seems to be rare to me. There's more people that seem to take it on as their identity. It becomes really hard to pivot from that. And I think that What you're saying in terms of, it's like people want to be part of that group because they get validated. They want to, and they look at the other side as, yes, I don't want to say the enemy, but it is kind of like the enemy, and it is a need to have, constant, reassurance, and that I see it, on social media all the time, like someone posts something about whatever it is, even if it's about like the Pittsburgh Steelers, right? Something to me that seems less important, right? And how vitriolic comments can become from the other side or about the other side, and they start feeling better about themselves as they get more likes about their comments, and social media just really, really amplifies that, and I think does feed into those narcissistic tendencies that you're talking about, for sure.
The final grouping I want to talk about from your paper is those outliers, which I feel are the most dangerous of this group. I know I've really, really read between the lines on your paper, so I've really taken this to some other. This is how people read your stuff. I'm just letting you know. There's other people like me that are interpreting the same stuff from what you wrote. I think the outliers might be the most dangerous because really separating yourself from the pack, I think sometimes is a perception of being better. I do think there's introverts that struggle with being social with people. But a lot of people, there's a perception of being better, and you don't need to be part of those. And you don't need to be needing others. And I think if there ever is a reliance on other people, it's for their personal gain. And I think, all the rest of those categories, like extroverts struggle when they're alone, right? So you always want to have people around you because you feel bad when you're not with your group. But that outlier, that potential introvert that's not in those groups could possibly be the more dangerous one. Is there does that hold water to you?
Well, I am one of those people, so
I thought you looked familiar.
What, teenager?
We smell our own kind, right?
I think this is why I'm very interested in this, and I think I'd like to talk a little bit about introverts, in that in general, introverts, it's not that there's introverted people don't have a desire to be in the groups. They're not shy, right? Like, I feel like I'm an introverted person, but I have an extreme ability to be very, very social, right? And I don't have any problem being in big groups of people and talking to people. I just don't prefer it, right? Like, I get my energy and my recharging by being alone, not being alone necessarily, but being maybe with my family, my husband, being in nature, although I do like to be alone too. I think what you're saying, though, is there something dangerous about an individual who doesn't have the need for affiliation? And what does that mean? I don't know if it's dangerous, but I think it's interesting. It's interesting.
Those historically been all the school shooters? As we're recording this episode, we just had a school shooter.
I would say that's different. I would say those people really want to have affiliation, and they were ostracized. Those are different. That's a different group of people.
Gotcha.
Right? Those are generally children who have been significantly bullied by peers, maybe even by teachers, by faculty, those kind of things. Had bad, background experiences with their family. So those are usually individuals that had a really strong need for affiliation, but they were rebuffed in their attempts to get it.
Gotcha. Interesting.
I would say that the people that have less of a need for affiliation, the people that don't feel that strong pull to be in a tribe, are different. And I don't think it's better than, I think it's different. And you just see the world and you wonder why people align themselves in particular groups when they may have beliefs that don't necessarily align with everything to do with that group, right? Like, that's how I find myself. Like, I have beliefs across the board that don't align with any group. So in terms of political affiliation, I have a hard time understanding how you can just fully, and it isn't even, it's like, I guess you could think about it from a nationalistic perspective or a country perspective too. Like, it's believing, like, I'm proud to be an American, but does that mean that I'm never going to question what my government does or the choices that they're making, those kind of things. I think you apply that to these individuals, apply that to everything, right? Like whether it's religion, and that's how I started. I feel like I started being like that when I was 13, and I went to Catholic school for several years, and then I went to public school. I went to CCD, and then I, went on these retreats, and I made a determination that while there was a lot of things about Christianity and Catholicism that I was in alignment with, I was not ready to be confirmed at that point in time. And that was very different than other 13-year-olds. And I didn't know anyone else like that. And I don't know that it was, I don't like to think that I'm dangerous, but I think that there's just some aspect of certain people that there's just less of a pull for that affiliation. And I think that's really interesting what you just brought up about, like, because I hadn't really been thinking about that in terms of the school shootings. Obviously, what just happened is absolutely horrible. But my experiences, especially as a psychologist in schools, the individuals that usually end up in those situations are people that have a very strong desire for affiliation, as opposed to no desire.
I've said this many times in my podcast. If there were parallel universes or worlds out there, there's a version of me that would have been a school shooter. And because I was bullied mercilessly from middle school on. But what my process was to just defeat those people with success. That's what I wanted to do. So I had a clear vision of what I wanted to do when I got out of that small town. And then I made myself successful. I barely made it out of high school, and I don't have any college. So I've kind of homeschooled myself into all the things that I've done, from my entertainment career to the books that I've published that have been very popular to the podcasts that I produce for myself and for other people. I've kind of built my own bubble and inhabit it with all the people that I like, my in-group, so.
Right.
I'm sure I'm a psychologist's wet dream of peeling back the layers of this guy.
Did you have someone in your life that you were able to rely on as a child that really did give you good guidance, that you that helped you along the way?
There have been mentors along the way. I think it's fair to say that. And I believe that people orbit each other in a way. Sometimes people are put in your path and they're just there for a short amount of time, but their influence is like an immortality. So lots of instances like that. And I have a friends base that goes back to, when I was 21 years old, people that are still with me, that are still in this bubble with me that I constructed, and I like it. But I don't think I would be what I am today if I was in one of those cliques, if I was in one of those groups, if I had successfully become the jock or in with the cool kids or whatever it was. I probably wouldn't be here today doing this, and I might be in a much worse spot, honestly.
Well, it's interesting. I had a little bit of a different experience. There's a couple things I wanted to mention. I was thinking about what we were talking about, but like I had a different. I was the opposite in terms of high school. I was the homecoming queen, right? But I just had this conversation with my parents not that long ago. How I felt like the conforming forces of school kept me from being who I was. So it's kind of in line with what you're saying. Like if you would have been, and it took me a long time to sort of navigate out of that and realize who I am, right? And the conforming forces of high school are fascinating.
So you're a Gen X. You're same as me, probably, right? Yeah. So the Gen X kids, little boys were baseball players and little girls were ballerinas. That's how we grew up. That's what it was. And if you didn't conform to your dad, being the football player, the baseball player, the athlete's son, they gave up. Have another kid that maybe becomes that one, So, me, I was into science and computers, and it was a huge nerd. I was like such a big nerd. I was even outside of like the nerd class of people. I was that far removed from all of them, But I had, this is turning into a therapy session for me. I need to send you some money when all this is over. So, Dr. Jess did like tennis, but yeah. So, I think it's interesting you say that, because you didn't think someone probably encouraged you. Oh, you should be a cheerleader. You should probably be a homecoming queen. You need to be on the student council. People were in your ear telling you that's what you do.
I was class president and regional All-American soccer player. I wasn't a cheerleader.
I hate you. Okay, well, we're going to wrap this podcast up next.
No, but I don't. But I think that I underlying who, if you ask my husband what I am, I'm a nerd. Right? I think there were
Well, it's cool to be a nerd now. It wasn't in 1987.
But I think I was pushed in a path by the social and the athletic forces away from sort of where my strengths were actually, which was never led to my happiness until probably in my early 20s, till I figured out, okay, I am a nerd. Probably 1920, I actually figured out, whoa, what am I doing? This is not who I am. But going back to when you are saying you feel happy that you didn't end up being a school shooter, I think that also goes back to there are a lot of, unfortunately, still lots and lots of kids who are bullied in school, and the vast majority of them do not become school shooters. So again, it's that combination of the underlying genetic and specific environmental factors that combine together to.
It's interesting, talking for a moment about kind of the psychology of the bully. I think that all of these bullying tactics are a result of, kind of that indoctrination when they grew up. You pick on the poor kid, you pick on the smelly kid, pick on the kid that, isn't like your in group. Maybe you're picking on kids because you were getting picked on, or whatever it is. But there's certainly some of that. You pick on the kid that's the Democrat in school. You pick on the, what I mean? You pick on the black kid at school. That's what's happened. It's all part of how we've raised kids. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think there's all kinds of forces from media, social media, parents' own experiences, extended family, just, that sort of encourage kids to, pick on, I guess, to use your words, the kids that are a little bit different, sadly. And it's heartbreaking, and it bothers, it's something that, we talk about like schooling and homeschooling and all those kind of things. I think that it's really, really hard. I'm a huge advocate for school choice across the board, because as someone who has, especially our younger son, is different. He's amazing, but he's very, very different. And I've worked with so many, especially boys in schools, who had lots of different types of struggles, but were amazing human beings. And the particular regular neighborhood public school setting is not the best choice for them. And so I think that every child should have the opportunity to have alternative choices. It's not just rich kids that have parents that can afford for them to go to private school, or parents that are able to homeschool them, which is a huge luxury, right? I feel so blessed that we're able to do that. I think that all kids should have some choices about the types of schools that they go to, because one size does not fit all for education. And this is an area that I could go on forever about. And it is something that, I just worked with so many kids that had so many gifts and positive attributes, but all they were learning every day when they went to school was that they were the bad kid, or they were the dumb kid, even though they weren't dumb by any means or bad by any means. That's what they were learning in the regular school setting.
Yeah, for sure. So we've touched on social media a little bit. You've written a lot of articles on Psychology Today about social media, and I don't want to get too deep into all of this because we don't have a lot of time left for the interview. But I want to know where you sit on social media. You mentioned you're not on TikTok, which I think is really interesting, because I figured maybe as a psychologist, you would want to be on TikTok to kind of keep up with what the kids are consuming today. That maybe that would be part of just kind of your continuing method of plugging in with the new generations. Not trying to make you sound old or out of touch at all, and that's not all where we're going with it. But I'm curious, your pros and cons, the broad strokes on social media. Where do you stand on it? Is this a healthy thing for kids? How did you let your kids be on social media? Did you wait until a certain age to allow them to be able to be on Instagram? What's your personal take on social media?
Well, with so many things, it has a lot to do with who your individual child is. We want to make these broad sweeping rules, like you shouldn't watch this till you're 13, or you shouldn't do this till you're 17. But there's so much individual differences, and parents really need to know their kids' in terms of like the difference between our two boys and sort of what we've allowed them to be exposed to at different ages is dramatic, right? Because they're not the same human beings at 13. You know, they weren't the same at all, what they're ready for. Fascinatingly, you talk about TikTok. My 17-year-old has me convinced that it's Chinese spyware. So,
well, that's probably for sure. Yeah, that's probably an absolute. Yeah.
He's not big into social media. Neither, I would say, our two sons, and it's probably because they have been homeschooled. They love YouTube because they go on and they learn stuff, or they watch like ridiculous videos, right? But they haven't really gotten into posting on Instagram and posting on Facebook. I would say it is is social media good or bad? Yes. Right? Like
both. Yeah.
It can be absolutely horrible for a lot of people. It seems to be extraordinarily problematic for teenage girls, even teenage girls that in my own family. Not my children, but I can imagine, having been a teenage girl, particular types of social media like Instagram, where it's just pictures being posted, very problematic. I think I see it even with, middle-aged moms having a really hard time, and, the FOMO, and not realizing how highly curated the images are, and making people feel really, really badly. I think there are other people that don't experience that at all. They're so happy to see what they see. They're happy. It's a way for them to feel connected and feel affiliation. And so it's like very individualized. I would say there's been amazing examples of, back when it was Twitter, being used for very positive aspects of political uprisings or stuff like that. But it's also extraordinarily negative. I think that every person, every parent has to be aware of like their own responses to it. I definitely know family members who refused to be on it, like have gotten off of it because it made them, they realized that it was causing negative emotions. Other people, other family members, they're like, oh yeah, that I know what that family is really like. Look what they're posting on social media. That's fake. I think the thing that we try to do with our own kids is like let them realize that it isn't necessarily real, right? Like that there are filters, that there are, people are posting the best aspects of themselves generally. Going back to some of the questions you were asking, did we have any sort of cutoffs? No, because we haven't really had, our kids haven't really wanted to be on it other than YouTube. They haven't really wanted to be on the other platforms so much. Like I said, I think in terms of would we individually on a case-by-case basis, sure, I would probably, if I felt like it was really problematic or it was damaging mental health, that I was seeing, like if I had a daughter who was like looking at pictures and it was damaging her, body image and stuff like that, I would definitely want to figure out how to deal with that. But that doesn't happen to everyone, right? And I think in terms of, there's all this about smartphone use, and I don't know if you've read Jonathan Haidt's newest book, The Anxious Generation, and he thinks that many of the problems of today are based on smartphones and social media. And I think that's probably true, but I don't think that's all of it. I think that there's some aspects of that are true.
I think it's interesting because I'll just run this kind of just historically, kind of how this type of social media has evolved. Gen X, for you, I'm a little bit older than you, but we got America Online. Like that was our big thing when that came around. America Online, we all got on. But it wasn't really social media today. It was I think Facebook is more closely related to America Online than it is like a social media platform. Gen X, we went through all of these trends of technology. Facebook started for universities. MySpace was around before that. Remember when everyone had to have, their model MySpace pics and their music on there and custom tailor those pages? All these social medias have eventually not been popular at some point, whether the technologies were bought out or just the generation aged out of it. Like right now, there's not a lot of young kids on Facebook. There's also not a lot of young kids on Instagram. They don't want to be on it. It's like what their moms are on, right? So those things have become less and less popular. And I think what's really fascinating is when we got to the millennials were really the first generation with phones, with mobile phones, but not necessarily smartphones. So they got mobile phones. So they were no longer had to kind of be the latchkey kids we used to have. And they also got reality shows. So their minds, I think, were getting turned around. You started to see the rise of the Kardashians and like all of that stuff started to factor into pop culture. And then about halfway through the millennials, smartphones came to be. And the Gen Zs are the first generation to fully have smartphones and to fully have social media, where the millennials were just kind of that transitional period. And even your kids are sort of between, they're at the tail end of Gen Z and the beginning of Alpha. The Alphas are the really young kids, but like the cusp generations, which they actually have names for those too, are very interesting kind of in-betweeners, And
Right.
and you sort of have to watch them and see how are they going to want to consume their content, So I think it's really fascinating, especially for me as a 54-year-old person, like being there with the rise of computers, the rise of the internet age, the rise of the mobile phone, the rise of the smartphone, the rise of social media, and just what that's done to our civilization. So I think that generally these things are morally neutral. It's just who's programming it, what it's for. Like even Twitter was a device made to send a message in a certain amount of characters, so it could still go to your pager or it could go to your mobile phone. Like that's what it was for.
That makes sense. I never really understood the character count thing.
Yeah,
So
that's why, because you could only receive so many characters in an SMS message. That's what it was for. And people have even forgotten what Twitter was originally for. Like it's sort of outlived its usefulness in a way,
Well, I think what you're saying is like the morally neutral aspect of it. Everyone wants, I feel like there's so much, and there are very negative aspects of social media. And I feel like that, it feeds into so many of our cognitive biases. That's a whole nother show. We could discuss all that stuff. But I think that it's how you use it. I think that it's, as an adult, it's how you use it, and being mindful of how it makes you feel. As a parent, being aware and connecting with your kids all the time about how they're on it, how they're feeling about how they're on it. Those kind of things are really important. And understanding your individual children. You may have, like I said, one kid who it's fine. They're like learning stuff. They're watching science videos on Instagram, and you have another one who's like ruminating over the images of other people or other people going on vacation, and they feel terribly about it. Well, you have to have conversations with your kids about those things. That's what's important, right?
For sure.
Also, like with technology in general, I think everybody's always so alarmed. I read something one time. It was like when people started like having books, like individual books that they were carrying around, everyone was going crazy because like, nobody's going to talk to each other anymore. Everybody's just going to be reading, and nobody's going to even be looking at each other. And now everybody's like, oh my gosh, I wish they'd just read a book, right? So like we have this kind of moral panic over and over again, because we want to, like it's sort of like there's this anxiety about what this progress means. I mean, the newest one, obviously you're probably interested too, is like the large language models and AI and what that means for learning. All that's a whole other can of worms. And I see lots and lots of
I'm all for AI. It's going to make me live forever.
I'm a big proponent of technology, and I feel like we should lean into figuring out how to use it and enhance our capabilities.
I'm going to lock in my best look with my best hair. Already recorded my voice. I'm going to be around 100 more years.
But even just in terms of the learning, like help, people that are struggling with different things, helping them, becoming better at what you're good at. Sure. But as a psychology professor, I see lots and lots of professors, I don't want anyone to use this. I don't think they should be allowed to use, like there's this constant pushback against those things. And I think that's just the reality of humanity. There's people that are going to be like the early adopters and be like excited about it and like look forward to the change, and those that are going to be constantly pushing against it. I think it's coming, whether you're pushing against it or not.
For sure. Jessica, are we doing okay on time? I have a couple more questions for you. Are you all right? Okay. You authored a book. I want you to tell me about that.
So I authored a book called Who the Hell is Jean Piaget and What Are His Theories All About? And it's a fascinating, I think, short biography of a very fascinating human being who was probably the most famous developmental psychologist of all time. He was an absolute genius, and like learning about, like, he published papers at like age 12, I think it was. And he is a psychologist that really helped us understand that, before his time, people looked at kids as just being small adults. They didn't really understand that children were looking at the world in a different way. And he discovered that I don't know if you've ever heard of some of the early IQ tests. They actually are still around, like the Stanford Binet. So Binet and Simon were, they had a lab in France, I believe, and they were, giving these early IQ tests. And Piaget ended up working there as an assistant and started grading the IQ tests, and realized the answers that like younger children gave to the tests, even when they were wrong answers, had a very similar sort of vibe about them. And he realized just like how it just sort of opened his eyes to the fact that, 3, 4, 5-year-olds are not looking at the world in the same way as, older children and adults. And we can't treat young children as just small adults. And so it sort of, he ended up doing a ton of research. It started with his own children and really shifted our perspective on, they used to employ kids very, very young, right? Like, I haven't even read, like, I think it was Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, when they had like young children working in meat packing industries, and they just didn't realize how very different children were than adults. So Piaget was groundbreaking in his understanding of that. And then his whole theory he uncovered about understanding how children develop cognitively and go through these stages of seeing the world in very sort of like low resolution, like that's the way to think about it, low resolution to higher resolution as you get like into later teenagerhood, and being able to think about abstract thought. And it's just fascinating. And I think it's very relevant today because we still need to realize that children are not adults, right? Children cannot comprehend and cognitively understand things at the same level of adults. And we have to realize that, and we have to have adults that truly care about them making those decisions.
But you could be a 13-year-old queen, right?
That's true. There's lots and lots of examples in history where they're, so my older son is a total tangent. He teaches online classes about like the British monarchs, the French monarchs, like Roman history and stuff. And he just taught French monarchs this morning, and they talk like there's so many different kings through history that were like 14. And now we know with brain science, right, with neuroscience, that on average, most people's brains aren't fully developed till they're 25 years old. So
yeah. And they were almost dead back in that time. You were like living your adult career life at 15 and marrying and having kids and dead by 35, Yeah,
I mean, that's somewhat, there's definitely truth to that. But there were a lot of people that lived to old age, but there were a lot of people that died very young, a lot of women that died in childbirth, just a lot of infant mortality. So the averages, but there were people that lived pretty long lives. Yeah. But there were a lot of people that died of disease and accidents and stuff.
Jean famously said, "Only education is capable of saving our societies from collapse, whether violent or gradual," which I think is a great quote. So I want to ask you this because I want to engage in a friendly debate about it, because I always get a lot of feedback about this from professionals, from attorneys and doctors and things. I want to talk about the paywall to education, which I have a real problem with, like that you have to pay money to get smarter, because it seems like a highly educated country could do anything, but we make you pay. We'll give you up to high school, which we've already discussed K through 12 and how we feel about that. Let's go ahead and now make you pay for 2 years or 4 years or whatever to get to your advanced degrees. What are your feelings on this? Should people have to pay to learn more?
Well, I think what's interesting is you're an example that they obviously don't. You said you're autodidactic. You've learned on your own. You're obviously incredibly intelligent. So I don't know that it's necessary that you anymore, especially that you have to pay to learn. Even if you don't have an internet connection, you can generally go to a public library and get online and access those books. So learning in and of itself is pretty cheap, cheaper probably than it's ever been. The problem, of course, is getting those certifications or degrees The pieces of paper to verify it does cost money, and what that means. I believe that as we move forward, it's fascinating that we're in a place in time where I just had this conversation with a family member where I do feel like knowledge is so much more easily accessible and learning is so much easier, right? Across, what you can learn, like every night at dinner, we generally watch. Have you ever heard of the crash course videos on YouTube? Oh my gosh, they're amazing. like crash, we're right now watching Crash Course European History, and then we talk about it every night, right?
Interesting.
Right? Like the ability to learn is so accessible, but yet the cost of like a university education is absurd. And I feel like there needs to be a massive reckoning. I don't think problematically, I don't think throwing more money at the problem is the way to go. We have the ability to make, I can foresee things in the future. Like, why not have more public universities have fully online asynchronous classes taught by their best professors that are recorded, and people can access them at a very, very low to no price, depending on sort of socioeconomic status or something like that. It seems like eventually we're going to get there, right? Like, why are there colleges that are $100,000 a year when I don't know, have you ever seen like any of the classes like on Coursera or edX and stuff like that? You go and you can pay, I think it's like, my son's done a whole bunch of them, like $55, and you get like certificates from classes at Yale and Harvard and stuff like that, right? So I think we're on the cusp of that changing. Unfortunately, the traditional path of the 4-year college and going there and attending in person and all the costs that are accompanied by that are just so out of control, right?
My fear is that we won't get to that, because I hear this a lot, when I indulge in Shark Tank and hear Mark Cuban talk about it. And he says, look, these are technology companies, and technology companies want their technology paid for, so that all the research and the work that they went into to develop whatever algorithm or whatever it is that flows as education to you, they want that covered, and they want to make a lot of money off of it, and they want to sell this company to a bigger company. That it's tech and it's business, versus an educational institution providing these extension courses or whatever to people is really the difference, right? And I think the educational institutions want to hang on to the tuition more than anything. Why give it away, right? So
go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, I figured maybe the only route that we might get would be state colleges offering some ability for you to take an additional 2 years at virtually no cost or no cost. But I fear that I think a politician needs to run on. I think there'd be two great. We talked about politics a lot in this episode. I don't usually talk about politics as much in these episodes, but I think the two great platforms that someone could run on would be educational reform. Make the next generation the smartest generation in the world. Like, let's make that, right? And the second is credit reform, so we can start to even out where everyone's at economically. So I think those are two things I don't hear politicians talking enough about.
Yeah, I think the education question could be much more easily addressed, as you were saying. And like I mentioned, like I see a role for public institutions, right? I live in the state of Utah, like the University of Utah and the other state institutions in Utah, creating a very inexpensive to free 2-year and 4-year college degree program. And there's more and more of that with even the community colleges becoming more accessible online and stuff like that in remote areas. And, it just seems like that's going to be a natural role. I'm even seeing that happening more at the, 9th through 12th grade level, that more and more school districts and states are adopting, like, if kids decide they don't want to take the traditional public school route, that they do have an option to access the curriculum online as well. And I think that's wonderful, right? That's not going to be for everyone. Again, I'm very much that there's not a one size fits all approach to this. And I think we need to experiment with all different things. But
you and I are in a generation where we started to be the first kids that went to college in our families. I don't know how it was in your family, but that's how it was. My brother was the first Fisher to go to college. Like, that was it. Like, all the previous generations that lived here, there were no college educated people. And so I think Gen X, you started to see that people were getting into the college system, and those degrees were very meaningful. I wonder, and I'd like to know your opinion on this. Do the degrees mean as much? Because we know right now there are people with master's degrees that are managers of Walmarts and work at the post office. Like, are we just sinking a ton of money, a ton of debt into degrees that are meaningless at this point?
I don't know about meaningless, because I think that any aspect of learning across different areas helps you grow as an individual human being, right? So I wouldn't say meaningless, maybe not financially lucrative, right?
Okay. Right. That's good. That's a good clarification.
But I do think we need to question, and I think unfortunately, there's been a lot of very terrible guidance from actual school counselors, parents, teachers, like pushing very impressionable teenagers to say that they need to go to college, they need to go to an expensive college. It doesn't matter what I am someone that believes that you should go into something that you're really interested in. But you have to be realistic. Like, does it make sense to go into what does Dave Ramsey, I think, is the one who says, like, go and get a degree in left-handed puppetry that costs $100,000 a year? Probably not, right?
Right.
Right? Or I like to say underwater basket weaving, right? You have to be, if you have the ability to pay for that, and that's what you're, that's a totally different, whatever. But like for most people, that's not going to make sense. And having actual guidance for these teenagers who are super impressionable, don't have their brains fully developed, don't know what they're kind of signing up for, that's problematic. It is, and I don't understand why the university tuitions. I mean, I do. When you go visit the colleges, have you been on any of these college campuses? They're kind of like resorts.
Yeah.
Right. They've got like these, like they've turned into something that is well beyond a learning experience. So that's another issue. And I guess Americans have to decide what they want college to be. But to me, college is about an institute of higher learning, learning more. And I don't think you have to have like a country club style swimming pool to have that.
I love everything you're saying, Jessica. It's funny because I think the Gen Xers have all the answers. I'm just a little prejudiced toward that. But it's interesting that you don't see a lot of Gen Xers in politics. We sort of stayed out of it. We have not been entering into the ring of governing this country. Although we're really a very specific, interesting, and unique generation in terms of how we were raised and what we were exposed to and still being exposed to. I think Gen X has a lot of answers to fix things, but we're just not participating right now.
Right, more grounded in reality, I think. Like you tend to see that. Of course, we all have our biases, but just more realistic about the pros and cons of everything, right? And it is fascinating that, especially at the national, like we've not had a Gen X president, right? And we're maybe I don't know.
Ever.
Yeah.
We've never had one.
Which is fascinating, right? Like
and even like Trump's VP is technically millennial.
Oh yeah.
So we're completely missing from the higher level positions in like state government and stuff. You do see them, But the last question I have for you today, because I don't want to take like too much of your time today. The very last question I have for today, though, is a doozy. No, really, it's not. It's just another discussion I want to hear about. I want to talk about the future of psychological services, mental health care. I've always felt that seeing a psychologist was something really specific to the boomer generation and Gen X, particularly in the 80s when the popularity of pharmaceuticals prescribed by psychiatrists almost became a fad. Because if you weren't on Prozac, you weren't cool. Was sort of like everyone was in therapy in the 80s. Like it sort of really etched in, and this is okay to do. And I'm curious if this type of therapy is going to drop off with the millennials and the Gen Z audience. And if part of that is due to the cost of getting therapy today, or the lack of insurance, or simply people are going to use apps like BetterHealth or communities like Chill Pill app, or get on Discord groups. Do you think that we'll see a backslide of the interest in going to a psychologist in the future with those generations?
I think that probably you'll see it. we're already seeing a shift. Probably, I'm not a practitioner anymore, but I think you're already seeing a shift of more virtual meetings and stuff like that rather than in person. I think what's fascinating is, while what you're saying in terms from the treatment side of things, are people going to therapy less often? I'm not really sure what the current stats on that, but I do know that the diagnoses and mental health issues are significantly more among younger generations, especially among like females in Gen Z, sorry, Gen Z. And so I don't know about that. I think that you're going to see different and varied ways in which people are getting treatment for different issues.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think that there's problematically been overdiagnosis of many things. Like I think we started off talking about, like, you see these, I think that social media has probably opened a can of worms a little bit too, in terms of people thinking that they have different diagnoses based on other people talking about them and then wanting to be affiliated with that group and that kind of thing. So there's actually been a growth, I think, in all those areas, but I don't know that it's translated into a growth in people going to actual therapists. I think people are doing all different kinds of things now, using apps, definitely still lots of pharmaceuticals being prescribed. And I definitely have some issues there. There's a need for it, but I think that there's definitely a lot of overprescription, especially for children, for different issues. It's I think a very, kind of a total tangent, a very interesting area of study, and I don't know if you're aware of it, is like nutritional psychiatry. Have you heard about that at all? So there's a few psychiatrists, Christopher Palmer and Georgia Ede. I think they're both from like Massachusetts and Maine. One's from like Harvard, I believe, Christopher Palmer, and he wrote a book called Brain Energy. And there's a lot of discussion and research going on showing that a lot of the mental health problems that we're encountering are highly, highly related to our diets, specifically like ultra-processed, high-carb, sugar-laden foods contributing significantly to, disorders from ADHD to depression to even schizophrenia. So if you ask me where I hope that the field, mental health field is going, is to sort of understand how there are metabolic issues involved in a lot of these underlying, what we think of, we often historically, I think Gen X and boomers came up with this belief that what we eat doesn't have anything to do with how we feel, right? And I think we're realizing that's not really true, right? I think even on an individual basis, most of us at this, these ages, we're like, okay, I eat that, I feel terribly, right? And we're learning, so Christopher Palmer, the book Brain Energy, he talks a lot about how, feeding your body foods that are literally nutrient, you're depriving yourself of nutrients. You're not giving your brain the energy it needs to actually thrive. That is contributing to significant mental health problems. And they're showing that, changing diets, making more whole foods, ketogenic type diets that are like lower in especially processed carbohydrates, are having profound effects on people with significant mental health problems. So I see the whole field hopefully shifting a bit to be looking at sort of that more holistic aspect of not just wanting to treat like the individual with depression, because oftentimes there's so many comorbidities between the mental health problems of the depression, the anxiety, and obesity, right? Again, what did I just heard? I think something like, I want to say 50, I could be wrong, but it's something like an insane high number of children are considered overweight, right? And what that's doing, if there is this connection between not just, the proclivity now to get diabetes to mental health issues, this is something that, you talk about things that politicians should be talking about. And we are starting to see that a little bit, right? There's been more and more of that, but understanding we need to figure out how to pivot from this sort of disaster that we're heading towards in terms of our physical and mental health. So
That's what my advanced metatomics books really are. I start with the physical and then I work up to the mental. I don't think you can really get into the mental work without getting the body in check first.
right.
I really feel that that's important. And in my advanced metatomics physiological attunement book, which is the first of that series, it discusses just sort of the general things that people don't get right. You'd be surprised how many people really don't understand nutrition. They don't really understand how they need to hydrate. They really don't understand how to breathe properly. There are so many things that they're just not doing right before you can really move into the mental work. And that's kind of what those books are, is preparing you to get into the mental work and then to get into the much deeper mental work, which is the future books.
That sounds.
And
I will have to check them out. I have not, but
I
yes.
think, we are, body, mind, and soul, and you have to work on all three of those things. There has to be a physical, physical proficiency and this mental proficiency and the spiritual proficiency to really be a well-rounded human being in a number of ways.
I don't think people understand how important sleep is, right?
Yeah, sleep. I cover that. Yeah, how important sleep is. Yeah,
getting sunlight, adequate sunlight. You grew up Gen X, and everyone was trying to push you to stay out of the sun, right? We realized we need some sunlight. We need those vitamin D levels and stuff. So it's all, it's like. But I think thinking about things, hopefully the future of mental health is thinking about things from a more holistic perspective. I think that from the physical health too, like the functional medicine kind of stuff as well, and thinking about us as whole human beings.
So someone told me a long time ago, they said, to be a good leader, you have to look 100 years to the past and 100 years to the future. And at first, when I first heard that, I was probably in my early 20s, and I thought, man, that's like really crazy to think about that. And now that I'm 54, I go, you know what? I can really see a lot of that 100 years in the past now, and I start to, imagine what's the world going to be like if there's no more middle, upper, lower class, if there's the food is being, pushed to you as a paste, if everything's whey protein and junk and crap we put in our body, and there's
new world.
if the education and the food are the lowest common denominator that we're pushing to people, and the entertainment and all that, just like I said at the beginning of the podcast, that's what you're doing. It's
social media that if you're familiar with Brave New World, that's like a book that really changed my whole thoughts and everything. Like the whole idea of soma, right? Like it's just like you're constantly seeking pleasure.
It's crazy because, I see with my work, with my personal clients, there's concierge services that people that can afford it really like. If they can have the doctor come to their house, they'll spend $5,000 a month for that opportunity. There are former child Disney stars who would be willing to pay you, Jessica, $5,000 a session. That's just one-on-one with you. Then they don't have to go anywhere. They can't be seen going into a place, right? People pay for concierge stuff. And then there's everyone else. And those everyone else's are the Burger King eating, go to the immediate care center type people. And they're the ones that are going to get on the Chill Pill app or get on a Discord group to talk about whatever their problem might be, to people that are unqualified to be talking about those problems. And I fear this is where our world's going.
Right. Well, I think that to some extent, maybe I have lofty goals, but that's kind of why I want to write on psychology. Like, I want to help bring like scientifically based ideas to those everyday people to help them understand how, understanding what, it sounds as a fundamental attribution theory or like different things like that, just like basic concepts in psychology really apply to your everyday life, and especially like helping your relationships and your parenting and, just in your ability to be successful in the world and understanding the importance of conscientiousness, all those things. And I feel like, all of the different areas, and I hope maybe sometime I'll end up writing a little bit about nutritional psychiatry as well, like understanding, because I think about this all the time in terms of nutrition. Is it a lack of awareness, right? Do people not understand, do people not really understand, because as Gen X, that we were raised to think that we should eat like 12 servings of bread a day, right?
Right? We had the food pyramid, man.
So I was just talking about this with someone about that whole idea of I think one of and I might want to write about this too, this idea of unlearning. how important it is to have the ability to unlearn things that you learned in the past that you held to be truths, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do we help people do that, right? Like, how do you help people? I'm a pretty, like, I eat whole foods. I'm pretty heavy on the animal like, for my body, I feel better when I eat more like meat based. I was a vegetarian a long time ago, and now I find that for my own body, I have an autoimmune disorder, that eating, more heavily based animal products helps that. And I had a conversation with a woman in the grocery store, and I'm not overweight at all. And I was like getting a bunch of like bacon. And she was like, "Can't believe you eat bacon." I'm like, well, actually, I started having a conversation with her about, the misguided notion that eating fat makes you fat. Right. And I think and it was a really enlightening conversation, because she really was trying to do really low fat, high carbohydrate laden stuff. And, that's just like obviously one sample out of millions. And
nutrition is like a totally different episode for us to talk about. I'll give you my 2 cents on the thing I talk about. I'm a meat eater, but I have to say, I'm not really a foodie. I'm a gas and go guy because I'm incredibly busy. And I don't sit down for a really nice dining experience. I'm like, I'll eat quick. It doesn't mean I eat fast food, but I eat quick. I eat certain types of things that I can get processed as quick as possible. But I will say this, and I cover this in one of my books, is that I feel the oils that you eat are the single most important thing. Because when your body wants to produce new cells, it has to do that with oil. All those cells are constructed because of the oil in your body, and it will find it, right? And if you put shit oil in your body, that's what it's going to find to produce your next batch of cells. So if you're a canola oil person at the store, or you are getting fried foods at fast food, I just want you to know that you're creating junk cells. And that's really the core of your entire body. Everything is based on that.
Everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even healthier, and I try to never eat seed oils and that. Like, we, try to use different. I cook, like, we just had burgers last night. I cooked in ghee, right? Like that kind of stuff. But it's so hard with kids. Like, even like the Whole Foods, Sprouts, healthier type things still have organically, expeller pressed sunflower oil. Like, I'm hoping. If I was in charge of everything, like, I'm hoping we can, just in the same way that the FDA realized at some point that trans fats were so bad for us that they had to be literally removed and made to be removed. I'm hoping that we'll see how bad seed oils are, and like there'll be some. I'm not huge on government intervention for a multitude of things, only when it makes sense. But I think in terms of nutrition, it makes sense. We're seeing the results of companies going with like the cheapest options for oils. Mm-hmm. Not even just oils, just like I'm like happy when I see something that I don't eat sugar, but our kids do, right? And I'm happy when I see something that has actual sugar in it rather than like one of the
high fructose corn syrup,
or like maltodextrin, or I don't even like a million different things that people
or artificial sweeteners, which are
what people don't even know are sugars, right?
It's so like, let's just drink cancer.
I know. Well, I don't think, and again, that goes back to people. Are they aware? Because I had these long conversations with our 17-year-old. He's like, well, don't people know what's healthy, and they can make those choices for themselves?
No,
I don't know that they do. No. I don't know that when you have companies that are like trying to hide the fact that it's sugar, or they're putting, the types of, when you say sunflower oil, doesn't that just sound like healthy? Right? Like, yeah. I don't think people. So I think there's a level of awareness about nutrition that we could. I wish we could, when we go to restaurants, that there were ingredients listed. Like, it doesn't seem like that could be an easy thing, right? Like, just list out what foods you're eating. Like, how problematic would that be?
Yeah,
that's probably a crazy thing to get changed. But I'd love to see it.
Jessica, I've really enjoyed this conversation. This has been a great episode. How can people find you out there on social media and the interwebs?
So I am on X, formerly Twitter, too much probably, at Dr. Jessica 17. I have a blog at Psychology Today where I do all my writing, and it's called Beyond School Walls. I'm on LinkedIn. It's just Jessica Koehler, Ph.D. after the LinkedIn, I believe. And I'm currently right now in the process of updating a website I've had for a while. And I just changed the name of it. And it is called, and that's where more stuff will be coming. It links to like all of my things together. Psychologywithdrjessica.com. So that would probably be the.
And where can people get your book?
On Amazon, you can access my book. It is part of this series from a publisher called Who the Hell Is? And they're really interesting books about like famous, complicated people, sort of written as biographies and about their about themselves and their ideas. And in interesting and less sort of technical sort of terms. So the book is Who the Hell is Jean Piaget and what are all his theories about, and you can access it via Amazon. That's
great. Thanks for coming out today, and I do hope you come back.
Yeah, thanks so much. I feel like we could talk forever.
For sure.
MetaCortex Publishing hopes that you've enjoyed this presentation.
Please take a moment to listen to some other podcast offerings from MetaCortex Publishing.
The Danceology podcast interviews the great masters of dance, the working professionals starring in today's most exciting shows, and the rising stars ready to amp up the craft. I'm your host, Edyta Stawenska from Dancing with the Stars. Join me as I dive into the world of dance, uncovering unique stories and the fascinating personalities of industry professionals on Danceology.
Hi, I'm Father Daniel Duplantis, a Catholic priest, martial artist, and host of the Karate Priest podcast. Have you ever wondered what the church teaches about different topics? Are you a martial arts enthusiast or just someone who wants to learn more about martial arts? I'd like to invite you to join me and many guests on my podcast as we cover topics of faith, everyday living, and martial arts on the Karate Priest podcast.
The No Earthly Explanation podcast investigates the things that are unexplainable, hosted by world-renowned investigative researcher Donald R. Schmidt and scientist Ellie Ringo. Follow them as they look for evidence for things that have no earthly explanation. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Every year, tennis players from around the world compete for excellence, triumphing against all odds to emerge the champions. I'm your host, Maddie Harrison. Join me as I get up close and personal with these dynamic individuals and find out what it takes to go for greatness. Let's go beyond the match.
Cult Following is a podcast that studies the personalities and common traits of cult leaders and their followers. Get the real story behind these infamous and oftentimes tragic cults from a new perspective, through exhaustive research, and from interviews with people that were there. Available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hi everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fisher and Anthony Smith and is distributed by MetaCortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for MetaCortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.